Welcome to the FAIR Conference 2020, the premier conference for learning how to effectively manage risk from the business perspective. The FAIR movement keeps growing and helping turn risk management into a real and effective business science. I am pleased to welcome a record number of registrants to the 5th edition of this conference. This year's virtual format is allowing many more participants from all over the world to attend. We have recorded close to 2,000 registrants from over 25 countries, up from 60 participants for our very first event in 2016 and 400 last year. These are impressive numbers for a growing community that is hitting the 10,000 members mark and now counting over 20 local chapters across the world. The theme of this year's conference is factoring risk in decision-making, to reflect how FAIR is helping organizations all over the world to transform risk management from merely a reporting practice to one that helps them consistently make better operational and strategic decisions and better meet regulatory requirements. The agenda mixes thought-provoking presentations by industry leaders, practical case studies, and highly informative panels featuring risk practitioners, board members, regulators, to help expand your knowledge and thinking about effective risk management practices. You will notice that sessions are organized in multiple parallel tracks according to your level of adoption of FAIR and specific industries. If you are interested in multiple sessions that are airing simultaneously, do not despair. The recording of the sessions will be available for viewing on the FAIR Conference 2020 website for 30 days, and on the members-only link website beyond that. I want to thank all the speakers that are generously sharing their expertise and knowledge with the wider FAIR community. I continue to be amazed by the quality of sharing and contributions within this community at events like this one and the local chapters. You will be able to interact with the speakers and panelists live using the chat feature. So take advantage of it. And last, I want to thank our sponsors, without whom this conference wouldn't be possible. First of all, our technical advisor, RiskLens, that founded the FAIR Institute along with industry-leading firms and continues to support its mission with research and operational expertise. Our FAIR Institute sponsors, first of all, Protiviti, the founding advisory partner, Risk Recon, a MasterCard company specialized in third-party risk management, CyberVista, a leader in cybersecurity and cyber risk workforce development, Cisco, who is incorporating FAIR practices within its organization and is committed to making the internet a safer place. I also want to recognize our conference sponsors, IBM, who just announced the launch of its cyber risk quantification services based on FAIR. NormShield, who earlier this year launched its FAIR-based risk scoring vendor assessment solution. Booz Allen Hamilton, who incorporates FAIR in its cyber risk assessment services. Our community partner, ISSA, and our news sponsor, the CyberWire. We are committed here at the FAIR Institute to presenting to you vendors that have been vetted and have confirmed solutions based on FAIR. Please make sure to visit them in the virtual exhibit hall to learn about their solutions and evaluate how they can help you on the journey to help FAIR-based risk management programs. Now, let's have the conference begin. And what better start than hearing directly from the original author of FAIR, Jack Jones, chairman of the FAIR Institute and chief risk scientist at RiskLens, and Phil Venables, board member and senior advisor for cybersecurity and risk at Goldman Sachs. Enjoy your conference.
Well, thank you, Nick, for the introduction. I'm excited to join you for what promises to be 2 days of great sessions and engaging speakers. I would, of course, prefer to be with you in person, but that's not an option this year. Our virtual conference is a great alternative, and I hope you agree. So let's get into the session. Our keynote today focuses on the very foundation for FAIR's existence, essentially the need to provide higher quality and more useful risk information to decision makers. And because this is such a crucial topic, we decided to make this keynote a little different this year. Instead of having me drone on by myself, I'm joined by one of the most accomplished professionals in our industry, Phil Venables. Phil is one of the first people in our profession to hold the title of CISO, and he's a rare mix of strong technical chops, deep security expertise, business acumen, and throw in some wisdom. And it's because of these traits that he's on the board of one of the most prestigious companies in the world. And that doesn't just happen. I mean, people on that board are there because they're special. And so with that, welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
And so let's get this started then. I like to think of decisions as making up the fabric of risk management. I mean, everything we do and rely on is driven by decisions. And these include things like resource management decisions, budget allocations at the company level or at an organizational level, and prioritization of our remediation activities, the solutions we choose, even things like defining risk appetite and policies, and of course, then approvals regarding those exceptions to policies and whatnot. So Phil, in your experience, have I left out some important examples? And are some decisions simply more important than others in terms of the need for good risk information?
I think there's a few extra things, and I wouldn't say they're necessarily major things, but they're becoming quite significant for some organizations. So, for example, one of the useful approaches for doing more quantified approaches to risk measurement is to help you with your insurance coverage and deciding whether, if you're a purchaser of insurance, whether it's cyber insurance or in fact other types of insurance, fraud, business disruption, etc. If you've done your own measurement, you're more able to work with your insurers to be able to figure out what's the appropriate degree of coverage and exemptions. The other one as well, and this is probably more centered around financial institutions, which is applying risk measurement to determine how much loss absorbing capital you should retain, which is also can be a significant thing if you're retaining too much, because then you're not deploying that to business for business purposes. And this is included in things like stress tests and other things that occurs in a lot of large financial institutions. But probably the big thing though is, and I think you were kind of touching on this as well, is to think about how you would apply much more quantitative methods to determine where your risk is, to then step back and think, where should we apply more thematic driven solutions? We should embed more opinionated platforms and infrastructure to solve for that commonly identified set of risks across the environment. So I think risk quantification is not just a tool to identify point risk mitigants and uplifts. It can be used as a strategic wedge to determine how you reconfigure your environment to more broadly solve for a whole category of risk issues.
Those are great points, and I appreciate you fleshing that out for me. So the other thing I think that's, maybe it's obvious, but it feels like sometimes people don't recognize, and that is that for any decision requires a comparison between the choices you face. So for example, resource allocation, being able to compare one concern versus another, or prioritizing when something is going to occur versus when something else is going to be dealt with, which choices, which solutions you're going to deploy, and things like that. And the bottom line in terms of fair fit into this is that each of these comparisons is invariably based on some form of measurement, every last one of them, which means that the quality of measurement matters a lot, which begs the question then, what are the criteria for good risk measurement? So Phil, in your mind, when you think about criteria for good risk measurement, what are the things that come first to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what you kind of mentioned. I would say the other one is and it's kind of implied, but it's useful to talk about, is that things need to be directionally consistent. And so, in other words, if your measurements are actually saying things are getting better, then things should actually be getting better. Now, I know that's kind of a statement of the obvious, but there's actually plenty of quantification that you see that looks accurate, but is kind of volatile in the measurements, and it's not directionally consistent. And so, in many respects, there's a lot of good quantification may not necessarily have to be wholly accurate, as long as it's directionally consistent, and the fact that you're kind of demonstrating and measuring that you're pointing in the right direction. The other thing I would say, and this again may be another little bit of a statement of the obvious, but sometimes it's kind of missed when you see some kind of case studies or when you see examples of risk measurement, which is things have got to be action oriented. You've got to take a measurement and be able to go and just pass the so what test, which is you've got to be able to sit down yourself as a risk professional, and you've got to be able to sit down with management at various levels in your organizations, and things have just got to immediately be obvious that the so what is because of this measurement, it's clear we should now do something about X, Y, or Z, or take some action. Now, it's also probably worth pointing out that these things don't need to be kind of earth-shatteringly insightful conclusions. It's actually totally fine if your measurement apparatus is delivering a whole sequence of micro action recommendations that build up over time, but every single one has got to be not just informative, it's got to drive some action and pass the so what test.
Yeah, those are great points, and I love your reference to directionally correct, and where my mind went when you said that is to a set of slides that I use in some presentations where the old phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? Which is essentially your point, I think. And as long as, let's put it into the context of a map of the world, which is a model of the world, as long as the cardinal directions are correct on the map, at least from that perspective, you have directional correctness.
Right.
And that is crucial. So when I think of criteria for good measurement, I think of timeliness. I mean, because if the information isn't in the hands of the decision maker when they need to, pull the trigger, so to speak, then it's not useful. Reliable accuracy, which is different than precision, and I think it aligns nicely with your comment about directional correctness. A useful degree of precision, which is an acknowledgement of uncertainty and the need to be actionable. You have to have enough precision in order to understand the effects, if you will, of the action. Right. And then the last one I would add is it shouldn't be cost prohibitive. I mean, if it's too expensive in whatever form to acquire the risk information, then that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
so
I think another interesting one, and it's sort of a corollary of timeliness, is delivering them in the right context such that they're ready, they can be consumed. And this is the classic example, again, as a risk manager, if you've developed some assessment or quantification and you just kind of deliver that to a line of business and it's just totally out of context, then they may not pay sufficient attention to it. Whereas you deliver it in the context with other risks, a venue where risks are being discussed and actions are being prioritized. And so I think sometimes as risk professionals, we can underrate almost like the human factors of delivering our results and figuring out what's the organizational dynamic to make sure that these are best consumed in the right way. Which I think is a little bit related to timeliness, although I think you were really thinking about what's the latency between measuring something and delivering the results.
Yeah, no, but your context point is spot on, which to me brings us back to being able to express risk in economic terms is, in my experience at least, has been a huge advantage. You know, prior to applying FAIR, when I was using ordinal values and such, you know, the ability for a business executive to take those values I was presenting, maybe there were colors or words or ordinal numbers or something like that, and compare those against, you know, the context they're typically operating in and basing decisions on, which is revenue generation or cost management, that sort of thing. It places them at, I think, a significant disadvantage when they're having to, in their own minds, sort of reconcile these different forms of information. Is that consistent with your experience too?
No, exactly, and things have got to relate to each other, and in fact, I think in many different businesses, it's interesting sometimes to see the information risk professionals having quantified some potential loss and feel frustrated that action may not be taken on that, and yet when they sit down to discuss that in the wider context of some other business risks, then they see that there are business risks of like 10 to 100 times more magnitude than that risk, and then people start to understand why there may be some reticence to prioritize certain things when there's even bigger risks to be looked at. And also, in many respects as well, it may be that when separate risks from different risk domains are brought together, there may be a common solution for all of them that may be more cost justifiable because they can address multiple risks, whether it's a compliance issue, a safety issue, a security issue, or a resiliency issue brought together. And so I think one of the things I think, as I mentioned, I don't think we talk about enough as an industry is how to bring risks together of different forms of quantification to make a bigger case for their collective mitigation.
Yeah, your comment about comparing the risks that we're dealing with the other sorts of risks that organizations tend to have to manage, it took me back almost 20 years, not quite 20 years, maybe 18 years, when I was first applying FAIR at Nationwide Insurance as a CISO there, and I, you know, quantified this loss exposure from this concern we had, and, you know, went to express my concerns to the executive team, and they pretty much shoved me out of the office, saying, "We're wrestling hurricane in the Gulf, you know, that's bearing down on us, and it's going to cost potentially in the billions, and you're talking about a couple $1 million exposure. Don't waste our time."
Right.
So it was a good learning experience.
Yep.
Yeah. So, you know, historically in our profession, organizations have relied on risk measurements that are essentially based on practitioner gut and instinct, and the use of ordinal values and benchmarking scores and compliance measurements, maturity levels, et cetera. In your view, how do those practices stand up relative to the criteria we just discussed about, you know, good and useful risk measurement?
Well, I think, I mean, at some level, and again, we've got to be kind of careful here because, you know, I mean, a former mentor of mine, you know, when I was being schooled in risk management, well, you know, once said to me that risk is managed by smart people with lots of experience and judgment, and they should use data to inform their decisions. So I think one of the things that gets confused sometimes is even in the presence of data and actual quantified risk measurement, there's still a high degree of judgment needed. And I think sometimes when we, and I know you weren't doing this, but sometimes when people set up kind of qualitative and quantitative almost against each other, it loses the fact that any good risk manager is going to use both. And in fact, you know, when you go back and look at through various kind of events in various companies, there's been as many mistakes made by blindly following the output of models that contradict people's judgment as there have been mistakes made by people using their gut instinct informed by no data. And so I think we've got to be careful on both sides. But I think that the broader point though is I think it's absolutely right. I mean, I think if you hear that people are just using gut instinct without being informed by any data to drive their judgment, then I think all of the audience watching this will probably totally appreciate that you just got to read the works of Kahneman and everybody else to look at how flawed human decision-making process is and how people overestimate their ability to judge these things. So like I think never underestimate the value of judgment and the value of consuming multiple data points and using experience to spot when things are not going great. And the classic example, you look back in the financial crisis, the companies that did okay in the financial crisis were the ones that looked at reality versus what the models were saying, and those that didn't, followed the models. And so, and I think to your point before about you kind of most models are useful, some may be correct, and all the associated relations to that hypothesis. I think the other challenge is always going to be making sure that you've got some degree of believability and sanity checking of the output of models, and I think that's where judgment really kicks in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, and I hear Douglas Hubbard talk about this a lot in the research he's done, and that he cites substantiates that, model-driven measurements invariably outperform unaided judgments. But to your point, models can be horrifically bad. Not just imperfect, but just cardinal directions are wrong. East is not east. And there are some really well-known models of that nature in our profession that are foundationally broken. And so when I think about the fit between, judgment and its crucial role, it's, at least in my experience, having model-driven analysis where there's some rigor around the analysis rather than just this. Having rigor around the analysis, and the analysis honestly can be qualitative or quantitative, but there's rigor there, there's structure, there's critical thinking going on, there's an examination of assumptions and such. And that sort of work that goes into the data that is then given to the person who has to exercise judgment, that's the best combination, because as you say, judgment is always involved. I mean, there is no purely objective risk management, in my experience. It always involves some amount of subjectivity and human instinct and whatnot. But that will almost always, if not always, end up with a better result if the data brought before that person applying the judgment has some level of rigor and structure and critical thinking and such associated with it.
Right. No, I think that's right. And I'm looking at the other thing as well. I'd come back to is kind of the comment about kind of compliance and benchmarks and all of that kind of stuff. Is again, I think that's another space that gets a bit of a bad rap by kind of risk managers sometimes, because and I think again, a lot of the audience will appreciate this is sometimes if you adopt a common baseline of controls, let's say in cyber it could be the CIS critical controls, what used to be the SANS top 20, and there's various others, and if you just say, look, it's just going to be cheaper for me to just flood my environment with that baseline level of control. And in some cases, it won't be enough control. And in some cases, it will be too much control. But you know what? It's just cheaper to put it everywhere than it is to microanalyze every risk. And the good thing about that is what you can then do is you then can focus in your efforts on the places where you can get most return from a deep risk analysis, where you're looking at highly critical systems that are facing very sophisticated threat actors, where you need to put in more bespoke controls, or where you're analyzing the interplay of different types of risk. If you push a security risk down and you spike a resiliency risk, or vice versa. And so having a compliance approach is a necessary but not sufficient condition for security. But the good thing about it is it also frees you up to then do the actual work of risk measurement in the places where you need it. So again, I think that's another one. Sometimes people set up compliance and risk against each other, where it's more like a Venn diagram, where you can get a lot of value out of basic compliance as long as you realize it doesn't deliver you all of the controls you need, but it clears the field for you to focus in where you need to focus your risk measurement activity.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And Mike, when I was practicing CISO, my use of FAIR, how I would characterize it to regulators and others who might primarily focus, and this isn't to say that regulators focus just on compliance, because that's not true, but there are some stakeholders out there who focus more strongly on compliance. And how I would characterize it is, risk analysis allows me to do smart compliance. I can prioritize my compliance efforts based on risk. I can find solutions to meet compliance objectives more cost effectively based on risk. And one example was, meeting one organization where I was CISO, we had to meet the PCI compliant, requirement for encryption of data at rest. And I found a solution other than encryption, because at the time, encryption of data at rest was horribly expensive. And frankly, the cost benefit when you did the analysis wasn't there. It's a little different story now, but back then that was, very clearly the case. I found an alternative set of controls that allowed me to meet that objective of protecting data at rest without encryption. And I could show through the analysis that I actually reduced risk more than I would have with encryption at a tenth the cost.
Right. And
so being able to do risk analysis in the context of meeting compliance objectives, I think the two, like you say, there's an opportunity to leverage both to really good effect.
Right. And in fact, you just kind of prompted a thought that I should have mentioned earlier, which is often we focus risk measurement on determining what controls to apply to reduce our residual risk. But one of the other good places to apply risk measurement is to look at the inherent risk and to see if there's any ways of doing risk avoidance. And so I've seen a lot of organizations, for example, in their supply chain risk, instead of forever just battening down on the suppliers to get them to implement more and more controls, actually take a different view, which is think about, how do I de-risk my supply chain by working with my suppliers to have them deliver me my services in a way that I don't have to share as much sensitive information, or if I do have to share as sensitive information, that it's kept for a limited time so that there's not an accumulated exposure. And in many cases, some of that inherent risk reduction is way more cost effective than actually just mitigating control risk to reduce your residual risk.
Absolutely, and that's a great example. And again, reaching back into my experience as a CISO, we did that with regard to production data in a test environment. And at the time, many of the controls for obfuscating sensitive information weren't available then. And so the options were production level controls in the test and development environment, which is kind of a non-starter in the conversations with executives, or what. And the or what was, again, what I did with Ferris, I said, well, what if we limited the volume of records in those environments to under 10,000 records? We can do the analysis of how much loss exposure exists for a compromise of the smaller volume of records versus larger volume, which was what was in those environments at that time. And that was an ability to reduce that inherent exposure for almost for free, other than some policy and processes to put into place to make sure that, larger volumes of data didn't get in there and whatnot. But it was very low cost and extremely effective at lowering our exposure.
Right.
And I was able to, again, justify that as a reasonable measure by doing an analysis of it. So I think you bring up a really good point about disparaging some of the practices our profession relies on. And I think we need to give credit where credit is due, recognize the value in some of these things. But I think we also need to be willing to look ourselves squarely in the eye and say, how far is this taking me towards where I need to go from a risk management perspective? I mean, let's really understand the value proposition, leverage the heck out of it, but let's not overvalue it. And one of the maybe most obvious places in my mind for this is the whole existing approach most common existing approach, I'd say, to risk measurement in our industry, which is, again, tends to be shallow analytically, if there's any analysis that actually takes place, and tends to rely on math on ordinal values, which is empirically proven to be really problematic in terms of accuracy and reliability. And where I'm going with this is that, and where a lot of my frustration comes from, is when we're trying to promote quantitative risk management practices and we get pushback saying, well, it's, what we're doing works now. And what you're proposing, we don't have enough data, or it's too hard, or there's no proof that the quantitative method is accurate. And where I get kind of wound about the axle is their arguments, for example, around proof, at the same time that they're asking for proof of quantitative methods, there's not only no proof that the traditional methods are effective, the methods they rely on are fundamentally unreliable by their very nature. And so it just feels like this dichotomy what I'm wondering is this simply a matter of people not understanding quantitative methods and the deficiencies in traditional approaches, or is it something else? What are your thoughts?
I think it's in my experience, it's, when I've looked at a lot of organizations, large and small, in different geographies, in different sectors, it's more about there's an overestimation of how accurate things have to be before they can be considered useful. Whereas in every other risk discipline, the modelers and the risk managers and the managers that consume and work on the output of those measurements seem to be a lot more practical and accepting of the fact, it's like we were talking about before, that these are all a set of signals and data points that aid a management process, and they're going to continue to be iterated and used as tools in a decision-making process, as opposed to something that seems to, in certain aspects of the information security profession, where it seems to be dismissed unless it can be a single perfect model that has 100% reliability. And it's kind of fascinating, because in no other field of risk management, in any other discipline, is such a high bar set. Yet there are entire, practices from safety to resilience to financial risk to fraud to many other things that are highly quantitative, that have multiple different models that individually are not in any way perfect, but collectively realize a useful business or other organizational outcome. So I think the education challenge we have in this space is to help people understand the process of using these things, as opposed to hoping that they're just going to be some like magic oracle that outputs a decision that people should follow. And I think as well, although to be slightly fair, and pardon the pun, is I think we also have to think that we also have to, and I know you guys are not doing this, so this is in no way a dig at the FAIR methodology, but we also have to just be a little bit more visibly honest to say that there are multiple different modeling techniques that are applicable to different scenarios. And so, for example, FAIR is very, very good at the kind of things that we've been talking about. It's very similar to what a lot of banks use, almost identically, in fact, to the scenario management approach for capital calculations and figuring out likelihood curves, severity curves, running the models, determining where your kind of, your loss exceedance might be. But then there's similar things, and again, these are not incompatible with FAIR. There's similar things where I've seen and used and got a lot of success out of the use of things like Bayesian network modeling, which are fantastic for modeling distributed control paths. There's a lot of really interesting research going on the use of game theory for modeling cyber adversaries, which if you'd have asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said that would never be useful, because you're dealing with multiple game partners in multiple rounds, and it just becomes complex too quickly. But there's been some really interesting work lately that's come up with some really useful heuristics for how to apply game theory to looking at deterrence and cyber threats. And there's some emerging interesting things that are depending on your cynicism, are either linear regression versus machine learning, that enable you to kind of spot anomalies, which are useful for risk management. And so I think, again, as a discipline, I think we also have to just talk about modeling in general, as opposed to talking about a modeling technique as being the one thing that can be used for all things. And I think the more we start doing that, and then, like I said, the more we educate people that how do you build a decision-making framework that use models, as opposed to just assuming the models will give you your decisions, I think that may start tilting everything in favor of people being more, more likely to want to use more quantitative techniques.
Yeah, I think those are true and excellent points. There is no one model to rule them all, as much as I might like there to be one. But when we're looking at models, I think it's also imperative to understand the models and to question the models and probe the models and such. I just, the models, the continuum of models range from the mental model of the individual, which is undefined and generally highly unreliable and complex problem solving, certainly of certain types, and all the way up to the really complex sorts of models, and of course there are all sorts of things in between. But regardless, I think it's really important, if we're going to rely on models, to understand how the model operates, what the assumptions are that are inherent within the model, and how it's applied, and those sorts of things. And one of the things that scares me is when I see black box models that you have no idea what's going on under the cover. And where I relate that to is, as an industry, we've professed and set an expectation for ages that proprietary encryption is probably a bad idea, because it's so easy to get it wrong. And I would argue that the same thing exists in risk models, particularly in cyberspace, but it's probably not unique. It's just what I'm most familiar with. And so when we're thinking about adopting a model, I believe we should enter the conversation skeptically and ask hard questions and probe and really seek to understand before we can trust the results. And so
I agree. I mean, I think the interesting thing, and again, this is where I think we need to look to our colleagues in other risk disciplines who've been doing this a lot longer than we have, and I know you guys have been doing this, but then seek to apply their lessons on model validation frameworks. I mean, there's a whole, as you know better than me, there's a whole world of model validation approaches across finance and safety and like hazards analysis and health circumstances, where there's not just kind of in situ validation, but also rigorous disciplines of back testing, such that when you look at the results of the model, you go back periodically to look to see if they truly were predictive. You look for outliers, and then you feed that back into the model. I think that's the degree of rigor we need to get to in this environment, and that's usually the reason I mentioned model validation is that usually sorts out very, very quickly a model that is, shall we say, a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Is the people who are pushing it are very resistant to model validation, whereas the people that believe and have exercised and have tested their model are positively enthusiastic to be subject to model validation because they know it's ultimately going to improve that model, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Right. So, it feels like we've covered a lot of ground here, and hopefully the folks who have joined us have found real value in this. I know that, I love reading the blog posts, and I encourage people to search out your blog posts because I find them to be a brilliant combination of insights and pragmatism. And, I wish they'd been around when I was a new CISO. Right. But I hope people have found this session to be equally valuable. And I sincerely appreciate your participation and help with this. And I've enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, likewise. It's, this is a very important discipline. I mean, where, I just so admire the work that that everybody involved in FAIR has been doing over the years. And we've got so much still to do on risk quantification to bring what we do up to the level of maturity of some other risk disciplines. And even those other risk disciplines, they're always disappointed themselves because they need to improve. And so, it's just fascinating, but we've definitely got to keep catching up, but it's still inspiring the progress that you guys have made, and all of your kind of the participants in the FAIR community and people who are using the tools every day. It's inspirational to see the progress being made. So again, thank you for inviting me to today, and it's looking forward to continuing the discussion in the future.
Thanks very much.